I'm delighted to welcome Edward Vickers today. He's Professor of Comparative Education at Kyushu University in Fukuoka, Japan, where he teaches and researches the history and politics of education in contemporary Asia. Since 2021, he has held the UNESCO Chair on Education for Peace, Social Justice and Global Citizenship, which involves a network of international partner institutions across Asia and beyond. He also directs Kyushu University's interdisciplinary Taiwan Studies Programme and is Secretary General of the Comparative Education Society of India. Much of his, of Asia, I beg your pardon, Asia. Much of Professor Vickers' work examines the politics of identity in East Asian societies and how this relates to museums, memorials, and heritage policy, as well as schooling, and the many volumes that he has co-authored and co-edited reflect his research interests. I'm particularly delighted that he's here because it brings together a series of projects that colleagues and I at Royal Holloway have been working on, many of who are also fellows. Indeed, I think Sarah is perhaps online, our Madam President. And one of the things that one of the projects, the outcomes of the project, which was a month-long intensive curatorial fellowship, which had students from 5 universities, Royal Holloway, Edward's students. We had participants from Pakistan, India, and from Taiwan. So they worked together to create an online exhibition, partly also to mark the Society's bicentenary. You'll have to look for it, but there are items in there from the Society's collections. And that is available on the Society's website. It's produced in partnership with the Heritage Lab. And we'd be delighted for you all to go and see it and test your general knowledge as well on tigers and tea, which is what the exhibition is about. And with that, over to Ed.
Well, thanks very much, Mrinalini and Alison, for setting this up. Well, I mean, without further ado, I'll just get on with my talk. But yeah, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk at the Royal Asiatic Society, both to those of you who are here and to those of you online. Can the people online ask questions afterwards? Right.
They'll do it on the chat.
Yeah.
I'll fix that up.
Great. Okay. So anyway, the speech that I'm giving today is actually adapted from one that I gave at Delhi University in late March as the Gidjubai Memorial Lecture. That was quite a different sort of context. It was 200 or so almost entirely female undergraduate students wearing very impressive saris. So I've had to, considerably overhaul this lecture for a different crowd with fewer saris. So that was called the Gidjubai Memorial Lecture, and Gidjubai Badeka was an educator who was famous, among other things, for introducing the Montessori method to India. And he was attracted to Montessori, not least by her concern with the intrinsic value of education and her vision of the teacher as someone who encourages and inspires children to discover and pursue their own interests. And that's an approach that contrasted starkly with the standard approach to schooling in the India of the early 20th century, well, and indeed today, as I'll discuss further, where learning tended to be narrowly examination-focused. Teachers and schools were subject to stringent government oversight, and the teachers typically a rather authoritarian figure. And Gidjubai's educational ideas were very much in tune with those of Gandhi, who was similarly critical of instrumentalist and disciplinarian approaches to education, which he saw as alienating and dehumanizing. For Gandhi, that vision of education was part and parcel of his critique both of modern industrial civilization and of British colonial rule. So I'm going to talk this evening mainly about my experience of working with UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute on Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, which is based in New Delhi. And, well, we might expect this, or certainly I did expect this, institute to champion the sort of educational ideals associated with Gandhi and indeed Gijubai. But as I'll explain, this isn't the case. And to understand why that's not the case, it's important, first of all, I think, to understand certain aspects of India's educational landscape. Now, I delivered the Gijubai Memorial Lecture at Jesus and Mary College, which is a Catholic college of Delhi University. And because of its church connection, it seems to be able to operate at a certain distance from government or from the central university administration. During the same visit, though, I was also invited to give a seminar to postgraduate students at Delhi University's Department of Education. But that never happened. Because of new regulations that now require any external speaker who's invited to address a class or actually do anything much at a central university to be pre-approved by the university authorities. When I visited another city during the same visit, I was advised to stay away entirely from the local university campus, and instead I met an academic contact in the home of a mutual friend, a bit like dissidents in the former Soviet Union. I heard reports of escalating bullying and intimidation within public universities in India, with BJP supporters being increasingly appointed to key posts and decisions increasingly determined on grounds of ideology or party loyalty, promotions and such like. Now, this drive for control in public universities reflects the BJP's wider educational agenda. The students I was addressing in March were enrolled on a program called the BA in Elementary Education. And the term elementary there is a little bit misleading because this was established in the 1990s to give a fuller academic grounding to prospective teachers and educational researchers. In other words, this bachelor's course was an effort to improve the professional standing and autonomy of Indian teachers, which has been notoriously low ever since the colonial period. But a couple of months after I gave my lecture, Delhi University announced that this program would be replaced by a new standardized teacher training program the government's seeking to implement nationwide. This would strip away much of the academic content of the BA elementary education and instead mandate a much more narrowly technical focus in teacher training. So by comparison with this BL Ed, the new program or the proposed program would have implied a deprofessionalized vision of teachers as sort of lowly functionaries, obediently delivering the educational agenda of the government. Now, that's consistent with the vision of a national education policy that was issued by the government in 2020. This declared the aims of raising educational quality and preparing Indian students for the 21st century. But this policy envisages heightened command and control over state schools and teachers and a narrowing focus on skills and on STEM. STEM, familiar with that term? And a greater role for private enterprise in educational provision. All of this implies, amongst other things, exacerbating the stark educational divide in India, with elites prepping their kids for entry to IITs, Indian Institutes of Technology, or such like, or Ivy League colleges abroad, sending their kids to expensive private schools for that purpose, while everyone else gets a narrow curriculum stripped bare of elements such as craft, arts, music, amongst other things, the sort of things that were especially valued by the likes of Gandhi and Gijubai. The NEP also encourages diversion of students into a vocational stream from the end of primary school. And that particular proposal was condemned by the former head of India's National Council for Educational Research and Training, Krishna Kumar, who said that it runs the risk of resuscitating entrenched hierarchies, especially at a time when unemployment is high, traditional livelihoods are under severe strain, and the mindless adoption of new technologies is de-skilling people. And Kumar also condemned the failure in the NEP to reform India's notoriously narrow and high-stakes system of public examinations. The BJP government seems happy to maintain that system since, as Kumar puts it, these exams can handle and hide social disparities by upholding the regime of merit. In other words, sort of distributing opportunities within society on the basis of these very rigid, very narrow examinations looks fair, looks meritocratic, but isn't. As well as envisaging an enhanced role for the private sector, the NEP also hails the transformative potential of educational technology. Now, fetishization of the market and enthusiasm for digital technology tend to go hand in hand, especially in India with its large tech sector. Infosys, for example, associated with the Modi family, which we feel a very close connection in this family, in this country. Given the profits to be made by tech companies, not only in India, but elsewhere, from expanding use of expensive technological kit in schools. But the new education policy was promulgated in 2020, in the middle of 2020. In other words, just as the flaws of the educational market and of digital technology were being brutally exposed by the COVID pandemic. So thousands of cheap private schools went bust, leaving countless students with no educational provision at all for months on end. And meanwhile, most Indian schools remain closed for over a year, forcing classes online. And inequalities in access to digital technology left vast swathes of the student population cut off from schooling of any sort. And that was a problem that particularly affected girls. Now, you could argue that all of this highlights the urgent need to close the digital divide in education. But then prioritizing the uptake of digital technology over other aims, such as reforming public examinations, bolstering teacher professionalism, and so forth, again implies a rather narrow conception of education as skills transmission. Alongside all of this is the core of the current government's agenda. It's Hindu nationalism. Frontline magazine in India described the NEP as a deadly cocktail of the Hindutva agenda and the World Bank model of knowledge, prepared to suit the needs of corporate job markets. In the text of the NEP itself, we don't find many explicit references to the Hindu Rashtra and the BJP's more nationalistic slogans or ideas, but a chauvinistic outlook and an emphasis on citizenship as uncritical loyalty is implicit in the civic values that the NEP emphasizes. As Anita Rampal, a former dean of Delhi University's education department, pointed out, the policy's guiding principles invariably prioritize duties, discipline, and social order over rights, equity, and justice. So that's the list at the top there that appears in the NEP with regard to values. Now, in pursuit of this objective of nurturing passive citizens unquestioningly loyal to the BJP's vision of Indianness, the government is seeking to strip the school curriculum, of any elements conducive to a more active and critical form of citizenship. At state level, BJP administrations have energetically been promoting their Hindutva narrative. But ever since a major reform in 2005, the texts issued by India's National Council for Educational Research and Training in Delhi have offered a more pluralistic vision. But this year, in April, significant changes were announced to those NCERT textbooks. And these, I've listed them there. So removing references to Darwin's theory of evolution from textbooks used in the compulsory years, removing references to the Mughals and other Muslim regimes and figures from history textbooks, altering the account of the life and ideas of Mahatma Gandhi in political science textbooks. So there's no mention now of his opposition to Hindu supremacist visions of India. And there's also obfuscation of the identity and background of his murderer, Nathuram Godse. Removal from social and political life textbooks of segments dealing with problems such as social inequality and caste, and removal from geography textbooks of discussion of aspects of the climate emergency in India and elsewhere. Now, these cuts to textbooks were justified as a means of rationalizing the curriculum or reducing the burden on learners, which is the sort of argument that's long been used by advocates of curricular reform. But to quote Krishna Kumar, again, because he was actually the architect of the 2005 NCERT curriculum framework, simply removing sections from textbooks, if it undermines the coherence of the curriculum, ends up creating greater confusion for students. And the recent changes are basically part of a drive to reinforce the more traditional top-down didactic form of pedagogy that the 2005 curriculum framework had sought to challenge. And that didacticism is consistent with the BJP's overall educational and political vision that emphasizes discipline and control. Now, that new injection of ideology into the state school curriculum is likely to further accelerate the trend for wealthier Indians to opt out of the public school system and send their children to Harry Potter schools in India or overseas. And that will then further fracture what's already a very fractured society, with narrow indoctrination prescribed for the masses, while elites are able to ensure that their children get a liberal education. Thrown into this mix of ideology, intense competition, and chronic inequality is another ingredient that has a special bearing on the work of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute. And that is the fashion for social and emotional learning, or SEL for short. Now, high-stakes public examinations are one way in which, as Krishna Kumar puts it, India's elites, governing elites, can handle and hide social disparities by upholding the regime of merit. But another way of managing the stresses that are caused by social injustice and inequality is to turn the focus inward on the individual. In other words, you portray stress, anxiety, insecurity, and so forth as essentially psychological rather than social pathologies. That's another theme of the 2020 NEP. We should recognize, incidentally, that this psychologizing turn isn't unique to India. So there's a recent book by William Davies, I think he's based here in London, called The Happiness Industry, in which he writes, psychology is very often how societies avoid looking in the mirror. Social and emotional learning has become increasingly popular with political and corporate elites at Davos, on the TED Talk circuit, and elsewhere. The idea of SEL as a package of teachable skills, fostering adaptability and resilience. You heard that term, resilience. We all need more resilience. This sort of thing features in educational reports produced by the OECD, UNESCO, and various national governments. In India, the psychologizing discourses of SEL perhaps hold a special appeal or plausibility for many because of the sort of Hindu, the associations of many meditative practices with the Hindu tradition, and the way that mindfulness or ideas of mindfulness are often woven into talk of SEL. Indeed, mindfulness techniques have come to be seen as a major Indian export, as witnessed by the North American success of Sadhguru's gospel of inner engineering. But it's not just the Hindutva crowd that is enamored of mindfulness and a psychologizing approach to solving social problems. So in Delhi, the municipal government, which is currently run by the Aam Aadmi Party, has run a Happy Schools program that seeks to spread the benefits of positive thinking to disadvantaged slum dwellers and others. It's important to stress that SEL covers a broad range of ideas and activities, some of which may be good and worthwhile. But it's often associated with a depoliticized, psychologizing approach to fostering pro-social behavior that is potentially dangerous as well as ineffective. Among the regimes that are most enthusiastic about social and emotional learning are those with the strongest reasons for distracting their citizens from social injustice and political oppression. In societies that are beset by extreme inequality, chronic insecurity, and intense competition, it's much easier to blame social tensions on individual social, emotional, or moral maladaptation. Both authoritarian despots and neoliberal ideologues are attracted to a vision of education that sees it basically as a matter of adapting individuals to the social and political status quo, rather than of helping them to understand their situation critically. The aims of education and the nature of the society it should serve are portrayed as matters of settled consensus. So we all know what education's for. And we're told that schools' effectiveness in yielding the crucial outcomes is readily susceptible to quantitative measurement. So all that's needed is for technocrats, economists, and brain scientists to use the evidence to tell us what works. So all of that is the context for considering the work of the UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute. So in the remainder of this talk, I'll discuss the appeal of social and emotional learning in the light of my recent involvement with that institute. For comparative purposes, I'll also say a little about related developments in educational politics in Chinese societies, because that's really my thing. The Mahatma Gandhi Institute is Asia's only Category 1 UNESCO institute, which is a point of pride for the Indian government, which provides the institute's core funding and appoints the chair of its governing board. The remit of the institute is education for peace and sustainable development, which is closely aligned with one of the key targets of the UN's Sustainable Development Goal for education, which calls for education for peace, sustainable development, and global citizenship. It also, that remit reflects core concerns of UNESCO's long-standing educational agenda, which, if we compare it with the OECD or the World Bank and other multilateral agencies, has traditionally stressed a more humanistic, less narrowly technocratic vision of education purposes. But, as we'll see, the work of the Mahatma Gandhi Institute has ended up pointing in a rather different direction. So what of the Institute's alignment with Gandhi's ideals? Well, we all know, or I assume we know, Gandhi as a pacifist campaigner deeply engaged with the political and social problems of his day. If Gandhi were with us today, we can imagine, well, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, we can imagine he would be horrified, if perhaps not surprised, by widespread communal violence and discrimination, not least in South Asia. He would see our environmental crisis as fulfilling his warnings about the dangers of machine civilization. And in response, I imagine he would be urging direct but peaceful political action. He would probably be rather sympathetic to Greta Thunberg's Fridays for the Future style of non-violent campaigning for climate action. And it's, you know, incidentally, I think relevant to note that the BJP regime has clamped down viciously on activists who have tried to imitate Thunberg in India. Gandhi would certainly see inculcating a moral outlook conducive to this sort of active citizenship as a key task of education. Now, given that India's current government isn't animated by any enthusiasm for Gandhi's ideas, I think it's worth explaining how the Mahatma Gandhi Institute came to be established in the first place. And it's a process that began under the previous Congress-led administration in the early 2000s, when India was competing with China to secure Asia's first Category 1 institute. The plan was always to name the institute in honor of Gandhi, and its focus on education for peace and sustainable development certainly seems to chime with his ideals. In its early days, in the mid-2010s, the Institute was engaged in some critical analysis of the politics of education and its implications for peace and social justice. So actually, how I came to be involved with them was in 2016 and 2017, I helped to write a report on the state of education, peace, sustainable development, and global citizenship in Asia. That one. But it was already clear that the report jarred with the agenda of the Institute's director. So you can see him there on the left at the launch, rather forced smile beneath that beard. Under his leadership, the Institute has increasingly promoted the line that science and technology hold the solutions to all social or educational problems. When the Institute invokes Gandhi at all, it portrays him as a sort of mindfulness guru. Rather than reflecting his skepticism of technology, the Mahatma Gandhi Institute has become a fervent cheerleader for neuroscience, AI, and education technology. Prominent advocates of psychological or technology-driven approaches to education sit on its governing board. And the director has advocated a personalized approach to education that he called once for pairing a bot with every child from an early age. So maybe from when your child enters kindergarten, you should have a personal bot will accompany him or her through life. This embrace of neuroscience and psychology is encapsulated by the Institute's current slogan, which I think was on the previous slide. Yeah, there we are, building kinder brains. Now, Gandhi himself condemned approaches to education that, as he put it, stimulated the brain but starved the spirit and emaciated the body. But the Mahatma Gandhi Institute sees interfering with our brains as the secret to promoting pro-social behavior. The director has spoken of triggering Gandhi neurons. Triggering Gandhi neurons through psychological manipulation and mindfulness techniques, and measuring the effects of educational interventions through brain scans or psychological evaluation. So, you know, these covers of the Institute's in-house magazine will give you some idea. They commemorated the 150th anniversary of Gandhi's birth by having a hologram of the Mahatma, there he is, deliver speeches on the importance of kindness. If you're my age, which I think most of you are, if not, yeah, slightly more, it might remind you a little of this. And sometimes this sort of techno-solutionism and neuromania becomes really bizarre if Gandhi neurons isn't bizarre enough. As with the cover image for this recent MGIEP report that I helped to write. Let me know if you've any idea what's going on there. Flying brains in space. But I'll leave that up. The output of MGIEP does enjoy a certain traction or plausibility with many of the non-education specialists in senior positions within UNESCO, as well as amongst corporate and political elites across South Asia and elsewhere. As with the focus on individual psychology or emotions, so with the focus on brains, I think the attraction is broadly twofold. Firstly, as I've noted, it trains our attention on the internal thought processes of individuals rather than on the messy and complex social, political, cultural context in which we all live and work. Indeed, it basically disregards ethical and cultural complexity in favor of a reductionist vision of homo economicus, or citizens as consumers, driven by a sort of Benthamite pleasure-pain principle. William Davies, again, calls this the neuroeconomic prejudice. And secondly, this approach comes with the aura of science, of hard, quantifiable, evidence-based data from laboratory experiments conducted by white-coated experts, not amateurs like, me and Paul at the Institute of Education. This sort of data is presented as incontestably reliable, in contrast to the fluffy uncertainty of the social sciences and humanities, which can be dismissed as mere opinion. There's a third attraction, I think, related to this elevation of science and evidence, which is that anything that can be quantified and measured can also be priced and costed. Psychological manipulation is also central to the commercial success of innumerable internet-based apps and the corporations that produce them. So it's no surprise that the promise of a psychologized science of learning readily subject to quantitative metrics attracts very generous corporate funding and political support in North America and India and worldwide. These neuroeconomic or neuroliberal assumptions loomed very large in this major MGIEP project that I worked on from 2020 to 2022, the International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment. I think the name kind of says it all. It was billed as a multidisciplinary project involving over 300 experts of various sorts from various disciplines, modeled on the UN's Millennium Ecosystem assessment of the early 2000s. And the Mahatma Gandhi Institute leadership saw it as yielding definitive conclusions on what works in education. Now, I was asked to coordinate a working group on the context of education, and I agreed to do it, partly out of vanity and partly in the hope that it would provide an opportunity to talk to the scientists involved about what the complexities of politics and culture imply for education. So I thought, there would be opportunities for genuine dialogue, conversation. But that's not really how the project played out. Because the neuroscientists on the team were listened to with respectful attention by the project leaders, but it was a constant struggle to gain any hearing for a critical analysis of the social, political, and cultural context of education. Indeed, several quite eminent social scientists very quickly abandoned the project because of the disdain with which they were treated by some of the neuroscientists and by the project leadership. The attitude of the MGIEP director himself is nicely captured by these comments he gave in a podcast interview last year. Let me tell you, it was not easy. There was so much mistrust. Many were questioning, why are the neuroscientists here? What has the brain got to do with learning? And I was like, what? Hello? This is where it all happens. And they, meaning the neuroscientists, have some fascinating things to share with the education community. And they were working in the field of education anyway. God, these social scientists are idiots, aren't they? In our context section of the report, we emphasize the complex ways in which culture, politics, and economics influence educational policy and practice in different societies, where you can imagine the reaction of this lot. Oh, boring. We stressed the limitations of a narrowly economistic approach to education and the dangers of excessive reliance on quantitative metrics in educational governance. We made the sorts of points I've just been making in relation to India on meritocracy, false promise of meritocracy, intense educational competition, the implications of chronic social insecurity, and the toxic threat of nationalist chauvinism. But none of this featured in the headline findings of the overall report. A summary for decision makers that was actually published even before the report of my context working group was finalized. And the key findings, as represented in that summary, included the virtues of whole brain learner-centric education, whatever that is, and the idea of personalized learning as a right. There was another thing. We should assess potential rather than merit, which is really disturbing if you think about it, because it implies a sort of eugenicist approach. They just hadn't thought that through, or had they? Meanwhile, my name and those of other scholars involved in the report was attached to an article into which, without our prior knowledge or consent, the MGIEP leadership inserted a sentence praising India's 2020 NEP as an exemplary case of policy guided by science and evidence. Now, where can this sort of fetishization of digital technology and neuroscience or psychology combined with chauvinist nationalism lead us? Here, it's instructive to look not just at Modi's India, but also at Xi Jinping's China. Today, China is at the forefront of efforts to apply technology, not just to education, but to the management of society in general. The Communist Party also has a long-standing interest in education as a tool of thought reform. The implications of that include re-education camps for Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang, national security education in Hong Kong, and the technology-assisted monitoring of, well, basically the entire population, as far as is possible. But these implications also extend to less elaborate or obviously repressive initiatives and programs related to education. For example, the teaching of emotional states such as confidence and gratitude has recently been a notable focus of Chinese policy. Today, young Chinese are told that China's rejuvenation should make them feel confident and proud. They're also told that only selfish and lazy Europeans, although obviously not the ones here in Sunak's Britain, look to the state for welfare and social security. China's happy citizens, and they must be happy, are expected to show gratitude to their rulers. Now, back in the revolutionary era of Chairman Mao, gratitude was actually not a word that you saw much in Communist Party propaganda, because it was seen as a feudal emotion promoting deference towards social superiors, which, if you think about it, is what it is, or what how it's generally used in political context. But today, that's exactly the mindset that Xi Jinping's Communist Party wants to instill. The Communist Party is now an authoritarian nationalist regime facing social tensions caused by rising inequality. And it's responding to these tensions by invoking traditional values, including gratitude. A cult of gratitude has emerged around Xi Jinping himself. There are special programs of gratitude education for disadvantaged groups, including ethnic minorities and migrant workers in China's cities. Now, of course, sentiments like confidence, gratitude, kindness, and happiness can be fine and good. My Catholic school are very keen on most of those things. But programs such as gratitude education for China's migrants, or happiness programs for slum dwellers in Delhi, or the Gandhi Institute's calls for building kinder brains, essentially set out to tell us that we shouldn't look to states or to collective public action to solve the world's problems. We as individuals just need to be kind enough and happy enough and excellent to each other. This is sold as a message of empowerment, but it actually disempowers us by preventing us from understanding how power actually works in our societies. It's precisely this political dimension that is so often missing from programs of social and emotional learning. Without that political dimension, social and emotional learning becomes a kind of psychological anesthetic, a means of social pacification. There's a recent study of programs directed at Palestinian youngsters in Israel, for example, that talks of effective governmentality through gratitude. And effective governmentality, or governmentality that manipulates the emotions, also goes hand in hand with a neoliberal drive to shrink the state and withdraw public welfare guarantees. This is because persuading us that our sentiments or emotions have some sort of transformative power encourages the privatization of social problems and the psychologization of inequality. One highly unequal and divided society that champions an anti-welfarist small state model is Hong Kong. Since the youth protests of 2019 to 2020, the Hong Kong government has sought to use education to promote positive or pro-social emotions, such as gratitude, again, amongst young people. It has a new blueprint for youth that seeks to nurture a new generation of young people with an affection for our country and Hong Kong, and equipped with global perspective, an inspiring, aspiring mindset, and positive thinking. I recently read a work by a Hong Kong-based scholar who argued that non-cognitive skills such as gratitude should be valued because they could contribute to academic success. So we can make students feel grateful. They'll do better in their exams. Isn't that great? So let's make them feel grateful. But, you know, talking of gratitude as a skill implies an instrumental view of children as learning machines that will operate more efficiently and cause less social disruption if they have this useful bit of ethical software installed, like that picture I showed you earlier of the chip being inserted into the child's brain. But what is gratitude, in fact? It's a sentiment informed by beliefs concerning what we owe to others in our families or in our communities or the wider world, and what they owe to us. So before we talk about whether or how to prime young people to feel grateful, we need to ask what they have to be grateful for. Take young Hong Kongers, for example. Which slide I'm supposed to be on, but anyway. Young Hong Kongers face declining prospects compared to their parents and savage competition for jobs and housing with incomers from China's mainland. Across South Asia, meanwhile, problems of poverty and inequality intersect with divisions of caste, gender, religion, and ethnicity, helping entrepreneurs of communal hatred to spread their message. Precisely because of such injustices and social tensions, it suits established elites to use the ideology of meritocracy to persuade poor people that their poverty is their fault. Hence Krishna Kumar's criticism of the NEP for hiding social disparities by using the regime of merit. But of course, this pattern is far from unique to Asia. In his recent book, The Meritocracy Trap, Daniel Markovits argues that intense educational competition in the United States reduces even privileged children to entrepreneurs of their own human capital. And this pervasive competitiveness becomes utterly alienating for less privileged people who can never hope to win the race for credentials. And this is part of what explains the rise of populism, Trump, and that. In this situation, promoting social and emotional learning, brain science, or AI as keys to solving our social problems seems naive at best or disingenuous. Talk of using brain science and emotional manipulation to produce content, compliant citizens should remind us of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, with its portrayal of a society of happy but childlike citizens brainwashed by a regime that treats them as its pliable tools. So that's a visioning of deadening pacification rather than of a humane, just, and sustainable social order. Gidjubai and Gandhi emphasized the importance of learning for its own sake, the intrinsic value of learning. They wanted everyone to be able to enjoy education, not to see it simply as a tool for obtaining rewards or competing with others. But in a context of pervasive insecurity, it's hard to imagine parents, most parents in India today, or indeed anywhere else, prioritizing free exploratory learning. they've got good reasons for pushing their kids towards careers in engineering, finance, medicine, and perhaps neuroscience. Realizing the educational ideas of figures such as Gandhi or Gijubai would require reducing the insecurity that drives desperate competition for a narrow set of educational credentials. And that means looking hard at our welfare and taxation regimes and our labor markets. If we don't do this, and if inequality continues to grow and competitive pressure continues to intensify, then we'll face escalating social tensions. And that will further tempt frightened political leaders and corporate elites to distract us with technological solutionism, psychobabble, and aggressive and paranoid appeals to nationalist chauvinism. I should stress that by no means all advocates of social and emotional learning share the Mahatma Gandhi Institute's maniacal obsession with brains. Social and emotional learning itself is not intrinsically wrong. Being more aware of our emotions and better able to control them is generally a good thing. And Gandhi himself strongly emphasized this, although he went to strange lengths to test his own powers of emotional self-control, sleeping with his niece. But the popularity of social and emotional learning with policymakers around the world today lies precisely in the fact that it's seen as an easy option that involves no hard trade-offs. With social and emotional learning, we can talk about gratitude and kindness and confidence and signal our interest in peace and happiness without threatening vested interests or raising any difficult questions about power and culture. So the risk is that SEL provides cover for continued failure to actually do anything meaningful about injustice or oppression as they actually exist in our societies. Insofar as education does help us reflect upon or channel our emotions, there's one important emotion that advocates of social and emotional learning seldom entertain, and that's anger. When young people contemplate the crises of the world that we've left them, anger is surely an appropriate emotional response. Anger can be a dangerous emotion, of course, but sometimes it's justified and even necessary. And when it's justified, the challenge for educators is to acknowledge and even to stimulate anger while helping to channel it towards peaceful but urgent political action. That practice of channeling justified anger into peaceful public action is central to Gandhi's legacy, but it's profoundly at odds with the interests of the BJP and its supporters and of corporate and political elites more widely. And that, I think, largely explains why in Modi's India, UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute essentially ignores the political, environmental, and humanistic concerns that were so important to Gandhi himself, and instead uses his image to promote a politically neutered, brain-obsessed, and techno-solutionist agenda that is the antithesis of Gandhi's ideals. Thanks.
For the benefit of those who can't hear without the mic, thank you, Ed, for that. I don't know, it was thought-provoking, but I also kind of think, oh God, it's also dispiriting in some ways. So I suppose one question to ask you straight off is, you know, what's the way out? Do you see light at the end of the tunnel? Or ways to get there, as it were. But before going on to some of my more, I hope, intelligent questions, does anyone in the audience have a question? And Alison is going to work out how we can have our online audience also ask us some questions. So I think I might need to close that. Arif.
I don't know whether this is recent developments are sort of into your fascinating powerful conversation, because the global event that has seized particular attention the last week has been the landing of the moon. And what I'm interested in is not that, but more going back to your presentation, in terms of the narrative. Now, still we're getting a sense of it. But and you may be closer to it. Was there a sense of the movement that particular people is somehow related to the models that you will be talking about?
That's a very good question, and the simple answer is I don't know, because I haven't actually looked at the Indian press or talked to Indian friends about how that's being portrayed. I can only imagine that it will further reinforce this fetishization of science. I'm not sure that Gandhi would have been very impressed by the feat of landing on the moon. He would have said, well, what's it doing for the people in the villages? Not a lot. And you know, what's the opportunity cost of spending those, whatever, however many crore or lakh of rupees on, you know, sending rockets up there. But yeah, I mean, it appeals hugely to many in India who are sort of enthused and take great pride in India's technological successes, which are, you know, are considerable.
The whole point about de-skilling, skilling, technological risks, de-skilling, was lying. Developing. You know, yes, using technology. Actually, on the others. Yeah. Well, no, should.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when we get onto the subject of skills, there's a whole other debate which is sort of developing worldwide about technology and its implications for employment, and you know, particularly with AI. You know, so obviously it takes a very high degree of technological skill, scientific knowledge to design a rocket and send it to the moon. How many of those jobs are there, though? You know, so here in this country, as well as, you know, in India, in China, pretty much everywhere, you know, governments are, you know, very much talking up the importance of STEM. And in fact, now China has got its Category 1 UNESCO Institute, finally. And it's an institute that will be set up in Shanghai later this year or next year, focusing specifically on STEM. I think it's STEM without the A. I think, you know, Xi Jinping is not so keen on the A, the arts, you know. Yeah, well, but yeah, I mean, you know, there's I think an argument for saying that, you know, the rise of AI and its implications for jobs, you know, and the fact that a lot of, you know, jobs that education systems currently assume they're preparing students for are going to disappear, actually points in the other direction. You know, we're going to have to occupy ourselves with, you know, things that robots can't do. You know, arts, crafts, social services. Yeah, I mean, that's arguably the future of employment for most people, which is not to say, of course, that learning in STEM is not important, but it, you know, it's not the be all and end all.
You mentioned at the beginning that you gave a similar lecture.
Yes, basically, yes.
And I just wondered what their reaction was, what questions, what comments.
God, that's a good question. Can't remember, to be honest, but there were some good questions.
It's there at the forefront, if you like, the primary school teachers.
Yes, although they've not actually started their teaching in most cases yet. Yeah, yeah. Can't remember. Yes, although I gave the lecture once in Delhi, then I gave a related, rather, I mean, different but related lecture at a smaller workshop in Sri Lanka, where the audience was mostly academics. And there I was talking also about, because I was relating it also to the Sri Lankan context, and I'd been looking at citizenship, civics textbooks in Sri Lanka, and how they deal with the theme of conflict. And they deal with that in a very psychologizing way. So you would have thought that, or you might hope that they would in some way try to address the causes of Sri Lanka's, terrible recent, conflicts. But no, they don't. They actually don't address the history or the context of Sri Lanka at all. They talk about conflict as a problem within individuals, and they sort of build it out from there. And I remember at that workshop, the local Sri Lankans were sort of, at least those who were dealing directly with teachers, schools and communities, some of them seemed to sort of nod along to some of the things I was saying. But there were a couple of people there who were from universities overseas who seemed to take objection to my positionality as a white Westerner making sort of critical comments about the Mahatma Gandhi Institute and about Sri Lankan School. This is unfortunately a professional hazard that I experience constantly, despite the fact that I've kind of lived and worked in Asia for about 30 years. But yeah, tricky one. I do need to reflect.
I don't quite know how we're.
You can ask Matty if there are any questions online.
Okay, Matty, are there any questions online? Will you
we don't have any at the moment. But if anyone here does want to ask a question, I just put it in chat that you can access at the bottom, and I'll read it out. I'll let you know if one comes in.
Okay, great.
There's a troublemaker at the back.
That's better. Your description of the school, perspective on it, we like extension work over time.
Oh, sorry, no, my work's not an extension of Ayn Rand.
sorry.
Yeah, the Mahatma Gandhi Institute. Yeah.
It seems to be a sort of devotion. Man.
The psychologically best adapted are the ones, let's assess potential. Let's, well, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's been thought through to the extent that Ayn Rand thought it through. But I imagine that, I mean, if some of these people read sort of lengthy books, which I don't think they generally do, but if they read Ayn Rand, they might find much to agree with there.
But the slight one ends up arguing the kindness.
Oh, these are counterproductive. Yeah. Yeah, it's more of a comment than a question, really, isn't it? Yeah. But yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
I noticed on one of the slides that the link cover the list of articles that think about how general UNESCO perhaps on the future of AI in education, role of AI in education. I was wondering, to what extent is this not quite driven by a UNESCO agenda or focus on, logical approach to education, but what role does that play? How much of this is kind of homegrown fascination or focus or emphasis on this kind of approach? How much of it is driven by big things like funders? How much?
Well, yeah, it's difficult to say. I mean, it's both. There is a load of money in research on neuroscience, for education, on ed tech, and also on sort of combining neuroscience with tech, various ways. There's a lot of money funding research on this. So they'll wire up students in classrooms and sort of, test which bits of their brains light up when, the teacher's doing this or that, or when they're doing this or that activity. There's a lot of money that's been spent on that sort of research, but I have to say, so far, not a lot to show for it. Are you aware of much, Paul?
I was asked 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah, you were, yeah. Well, that was actually the first stage of the project that I ended up being involved in.
Two things they learn. Brain scan. Yeah.
Wow.
To which somebody said, yeah.
Yeah.
And the other finding, no, it really was, there was nothing novel. And millions. But I think it came to okay.
But it's the promise of science that sort of intuitively appeals to a lot of policymakers or people who don't think very much about education, but just think it's a good thing that it ought to be working better somehow. Intuitively believe that science must hold the answers. But as Paul said, whereas science has not provided very useful answers so far, and the idea that it could or would implies a very narrow and mechanical vision of what education is for and how it works. So you're asking sort of where is this vision coming from? I think yes, partly the money, and partly as I was saying, the attraction of the idea that education in general, not just social and emotional learning, but education in general, will provide sort of painless solutions to social problems.
Perhaps we should, and unless there are any questions, Matty, what happens? There are no questions online, but Matty, okay? Matty, I take it.
Oh, sorry, I can't hear you on the mic. Sorry, what were you asking?
I'm just wondering if there were any questions online, but since you haven't pitched in, we'll assume not. Yes?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone anyway for joining us, whether in person or online. And thank you.
Or in the future on YouTube.
Indeed. And thank you, Ed, again, for a stimulating paper. And let's carry forward the discussion over refreshments. Thank you.
Thanks very much.